Every major war in modern history was sold to the public with a simple story, a threat, a villain, a reason to act. But the real reasons, the ones that actually move money, shift power, and redraw maps, those are written in a different language entirely. This is the Business Blackbook, where billion-dollar empires are built and collapse. On the 28th of February, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated surprise airstrikes across multiple cities and military sites inside Iran. The supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, was killed. Senior Iranian military and government officials were eliminated. Iran responded with waves of missile and drone attacks against Israel, American military bases, and U.S. allied countries across the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical shipping lanes on the planet, was essentially shut down. And just like that, the world changed. But here's the question that this video is going to answer. Did this war come out of nowhere? Or were the signals always there, written clearly? For those who knew how to read them? And more importantly, why did this happen? Not the official reason, not the press conference answer, the real reason. Because when you understand why wars actually start, you understand how the world really works. Let us begin. Part 1. The Long Road to War. Signals that were always there. The first thing to understand is this. The conflict between the United States and Iran did not begin in 2026. It has been building for decades. Think of it like a pressure cooker. Every few years, someone turns up the heat a little more. And for a long time, the lid holds until one day it doesn't. Let us trace the pressure points. In 2018, the first Trump administration made a defining decision. They pulled the United States out of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That was the international nuclear agreement that placed strict limits on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. When the U.S. withdrew, it reimposed severe economic sanctions on Iran. Not normal sanctions. Maximum pressure sanctions. The goal was simple in design: crush the Iranian economy, force a renegotiation, or force a collapse. The Biden administration came in after that. Many expected a diplomatic reset. It did not happen. The Biden years actually saw more economic measures added on top of the existing ones. By December of 2025, the Iranian currency had collapsed so dramatically that Scott Bessent, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, openly called it the grand culmination of the maximum pressure strategy. Think about what that means. A senior U.S. official was publicly celebrating the destruction of another country's economy. That is not diplomacy. That is preparation. Meanwhile, in June of 2025, something even more significant happened. The United States and Israel launched what became known as the 12-Day War. American airstrikes specifically targeted Iran's nuclear facilities. The U.S. Department of Defense later estimated that those strikes set back Iran's nuclear program by approximately 2 years. 2 years of work destroyed in 12 days. Now ask yourself a question. If you were Iran's leadership watching all of this happen, watching your economy collapse, your nuclear program bombed, your regional allies weaken, what signal would you be receiving? And if you were the United States or Israel, watching Iran respond to each of these pressures, what signal would you be reading? This is the signal architecture that most people missed. The war did not begin on February 28, 2026. It was simply the moment the pressure cooker finally lost its lid. Part 2, January 2026. The final trigger. Now, let us come to the events that directly preceded the war. In January of 2026, something happened inside Iran that became the final piece of the puzzle. Iranian security forces killed tens of thousands of protesters during what were described as the largest internal protests since the Iranian Revolution itself. The scale of the crackdown was extraordinary. This gave the United States and Israel a very powerful political window, a window that combined strategic opportunity with a ready-made moral argument. Donald Trump responded publicly, threatening military action. At the same time, in what would turn out to be a critically important meeting, Trump and his administration received a visit from Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu at the White House in mid-February. The subject of that conversation was specifically Iran, nuclear weapons, and the question of whether to pursue diplomatic talks or military action. Diplomatic talks were abandoned, and within days, the largest U.S. military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq was underway. Read that again slowly. The largest military buildup since Iraq in 2003. That does not happen quietly. That does not happen overnight. You do not park aircraft carriers, logistics ships, air squadrons, and tens of thousands of troops into a region in secret. The signals were visible for months, and yet when the strikes came on February 28th, the world reacted as if it was a surprise. This is the most important lesson in geopolitics. Surprises are almost never surprises. They are simply the visible moment of something that has been invisibly accelerating for a very long time. Part 3. The official reasons and what the evidence actually says. Now, let us go through the official justifications given for this war, and let us examine what the evidence actually says about each one. The Trump administration offered multiple explanations. The first and most frequently cited was the nuclear threat. The argument was that Iran was on the verge of developing a nuclear weapon, and that waiting was too dangerous. Here is what the independent evidence says. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, which is the official global nuclear monitoring body, stated clearly that while Iran has an ambitious nuclear program and had refused inspection access since the 2025 strikes, there was no evidence of a structured nuclear weapons program at the time of the February attacks. Iran's own supreme leader, Khamenei, had actually issued a religious ruling, a fatwa, banning the development of nuclear weapons of any kind. The Defense Intelligence Agency had concluded in 2025 that it would take Iran approximately a decade to develop a missile arsenal capable of reaching the United States. Now, none of this means Iran's nuclear program was harmless. It means the timeline being presented publicly did not match the intelligence being reported privately. The second justification offered was preemption. The claim was that Iran was preparing imminent attacks on American assets. However, both Iranian and U.S. officials at various points rejected the idea that Iran had been actively planning such an attack at the time, and the intelligence framing for the preemptive argument drew significant scrutiny. The third justification was protecting Iranian civilians, pointing to the protesters who had been killed. This is where the argument collapses most clearly. Within the first 2 weeks of the war, approximately 1,000 Iranians had already been killed by American and Israeli bombs. The bombing of oil infrastructure created toxic chemical clouds over civilian areas. If the goal was to protect Iranians, the method being used was causing immediate mass civilian harm. History also does not support this framing. Previous military interventions justified on humanitarian grounds, Afghanistan being the clearest example, resulted in conditions that were arguably far worse after intervention than before. What this analysis tells us is not that any single party is purely innocent or purely guilty. What it tells us is this: the official reasons given for a major war almost never fully explain why that war actually started. To find the real reasons, you have to follow a different set of questions. Who benefits? What does this change? And who was planning this long before the public was told? Part 4. The real architecture. What this war actually does. Let us now look at what this war structurally achieves and for whom. Reason 1. China's energy supply chain. China gets approximately 17% of its oil from Iran. Iran and Venezuela together represent China's most important alternative energy suppliers, sources that exist outside of Western-controlled trade networks. Disrupting Iranian oil exports disrupts China's supply chain. This fits within a larger pattern. The United States has already spent trillions of dollars in what analysts describe as an anti-China military posture across the Indo-Pacific and Middle East regions. The logic being applied in some strategic circles is straightforward. Weaken Iran, weaken China's energy independence, weaken China's geopolitical positioning. However, the evidence suggests this calculation is more complicated than it appears. China had reportedly begun building strategic oil stockpiles months before the conflict began. China has also been aggressively expanding its domestic renewable energy capacity. And critically, the disruption of the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran has effectively shut down, is hurting every energy importing economy. The OECD has already raised its global inflation forecast sharply. Global growth has been downgraded. Before the war, approximately 130 ships passed through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. In the weeks after the war began, that number had fallen to 6 or fewer ships per day. 6 per day. That is a near total shutdown of the world's most critical oil shipping lane. This is not a wound that only bleeds on China. Reason 2. The defense and energy industry equation. Wars in the Middle East do two things simultaneously for specific industries. They increase the demand for weapons, and they increase the price of oil. The conflict is already being reported as costing somewhere between $2 and $3 billion per day in military expenditure. That money flows from government defense budgets funded by taxpayers directly to defense manufacturers and contractors. Oil prices surged immediately following the strike on Iran. Oil futures became volatile in ways that generate enormous profits for energy companies and trading desks. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a documented structural pattern that has repeated across every major Middle Eastern military intervention in the last 4 decades. The people who make weapons and refine oil do not lose money when war begins. Reason 3. Israeli strategic objectives. This is perhaps the most clearly documented factor in the architecture of this war. Israel has identified Iran as its primary existential threat for decades, not just in rhetoric, but in policy, intelligence, military planning, and diplomatic lobbying. The June 2025 12-day war, in which American airstrikes targeted Iranian nuclear sites, was a direct precursor. Netanyahu's February visit to the White House, specifically to discuss Iran and push away from diplomacy, happened immediately before the military buildup accelerated. Destroying Iran's military capacity, missile infrastructure, and regional influence network achieves several things for Israel simultaneously. It removes the primary sponsor and arms supplier to Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthi movement. It removes the only regional military power capable of posing a direct threat to Israeli territory at scale. It eliminates the strategic depth that Iran has built through its network of allied non-state actors across Lebanon, Gaza, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. And it extends Israel's window of unchallenged regional military dominance. Whether one agrees or disagrees with these objectives, they are clearly defined, long-standing, and strategically coherent from Israel's perspective. The question is whether they represent American national interest, and that question has no clean answer. Part 5. The economic earthquake nobody is talking about. Let us step back from the military dimension and look at what this war is doing to the global economy, because that is where the long-term consequences are being written. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 20% of the world's traded oil, with Iran essentially shutting it down. The impact is not limited to countries at war, it is global. Oil prices surged immediately. The OECD has already raised inflation forecasts for major economies. Countries across Asia, which depend heavily on Middle Eastern oil, are being hit particularly hard. The Philippines has already declared a national energy emergency. Shipping costs have spiked worldwide because vessels are being rerouted away from the Persian Gulf. The U.S. Postal Service has introduced an 8% fuel surcharge on packages. Saudi Aramco's chief executive pulled out of a major international energy conference because of the conflict's disruption. More than 40 energy assets across the Middle East have been described as severely damaged, according to the International Energy Agency. Think about what this means practically. The price of fuel affects the price of food. The price of food affects the cost of living. The cost of living affects every household, not just in Iran or Israel or the United States, but everywhere oil is bought and sold. Wars are sometimes described as being over there, but when the Strait of Hormuz closes, the economic consequences are everywhere. Part 6. Where things stand right now. As of today, 28th March 2026. The war is approximately 4 weeks old. The situation is highly fluid. The United States has presented Iran with a 15-point proposal to end the war. Iran has described this proposal as extremely maximalist and unreasonable. Iran has responded with its own 5-point counteroffer, which includes demands for war reparations and formal recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. There are no direct talks between Washington and Tehran. Messages are being exchanged through mediators, including Pakistan and Egypt. Trump has extended a deadline for Iranian energy infrastructure strikes by 10 days to April 6th. Israel, meanwhile, has continued its own strike. Israeli forces have attacked nuclear facilities at Yazd and Arak and targeted major Iranian steel plants. Iran has vowed heavy retaliation. Public opinion inside the United States has shifted sharply. According to a Pew Research survey conducted in March 2026, 59% of Americans say the U.S. made the wrong decision in using military force against Iran. 61% disapprove of how Trump is handling the military action. In an AP Newark poll, 59% of U.S. adults say the military action has gone too far. This is not the profile of a popular war, and yet it continues. Part 7. What financially aware people understand about this moment? So what should a person who thinks clearly about money, power, and geopolitics take away from all of this? First, wars are economic events before they are military ones. The pressure points that led to this war, sanctions, currency collapse, nuclear negotiations, oil supply chains, weapons contracts, are all economic in nature. Military action is often the visible tip of an iceberg that is mostly made of financial interests below the surface. Second, when multiple powerful interests align around a single action, that action becomes very difficult to stop. The defense industry benefits. Certain oil interests benefit. Regional strategic interests align. Political capital is spent. Once that alignment locks in, the momentum is very hard to reverse. This is why the warning signals, the sanctions trajectory, the military buildup, the diplomatic failure, the Netanyahu White House visit were so important. None of them individually meant war was inevitable, but together they formed a pattern that anyone tracking multiple dimensions simultaneously could read clearly. Third, the Strait of Hormuz is not just a geopolitical symbol. It is a physical choke point that controls energy prices for the entire world. When it closes, your electricity bill changes, your food costs change, your fuel costs change. The distance between a war far away and your household budget is much shorter than most people realize. 4. Understand the difference between the stated reason for something and the structural reason. The stated reasons for this war include nuclear threats, humanitarian concerns, and preemptive defense. The structural reasons involve oil supply chains, defense spending flows, regional hegemony, and decades of accumulated strategic pressure. Neither framing is entirely false, but only one of them explains the full picture. And finally, the most important lesson of all, history does not repeat perfectly, but it rhymes. The pattern of building economic pressure, then using a crisis moment as a trigger, then deploying military force with multiple official justifications that obscure deeper interests. This pattern has appeared before. Understanding it is not about cynicism, it is about clarity. Because the people who understand how power actually works are the ones who make better decisions about where they invest, about what they believe, about how they read the news. The world is never as simple as the headlines make it appear, and it is never as random as it seems in hindsight. The signals are always there. The question is whether you know how to read them. And with that, the Black Book closes. Subscribe, and we will open the next page soon.